So Jimmy Hoffa was born and raised in coal mining towns in southern Indiana in the 1910s and 1920s. Hardscrabble towns filled with coal miners and bootleggers. A lot of whites from the South had emigrated to southern Indiana. By the 1920s, it became a hub of the Ku Klux Klan nationally, and where violence really determined a lot of conflicts. In the towns he grew up in, there were more saloons than there were churches. And his mother was a single mother who was forced to take in laundry from neighbors to support the family. Hoffa lived on the edge throughout his childhood and early adulthood, and I think that also defined his outlook on life and his career.
So Jimmy Hoffa and his family arrived in Detroit in 1924 looking for better economic opportunity. Detroit was one of the fastest growing cities in the country. It was also one of the most violent.
You had the Italians with several groups, the River Gang, the East Side Gang, the West Side Gang, the Jewish Purple Gang, and then you had other factions such as the Lizard Gang, which was a Polish gang out of Hamtramck. A gangland economic boom that was taking place not just in Detroit but around the country.
Hoffa was lucky to get a job as a warehouse worker unloading crates on a dock at Kroger's. He lived in a world in which poverty and unemployment was the norm, and in which violence often determined the outcome of class struggle.
In 1932, the very bottom year of the Great Depression, the year of the national crime wave, John Dillinger, Bonnie and Clyde, Jimmy Hoffa was about 19 years old, and he did something pretty amazing. He organized his first strike.
Wages. Workers striking, refusing to work, was leverage for simply economic means.
Hoffa was seeing the American system exposed all around him. Wall Street taking advantage of Main Street and the rise of gangsters and bandits.
Land speculators, banks, gobbling up land, foreclosing on small farmers.
For many people, men like John Dillinger and Al Capone became the heroes. Doing whatever it took to get ahead in life, that was what was important.
Jimmy Hoffa is growing up in the Midwest during the Great Depression. He's aware of the outlaw personality. He's part of the community that is marginalized. These communities are responding to people like John Dillinger, Pretty Boy Floyd. So by the time that Jimmy Hoffa becomes involved in labor politics, I mean, this is an important part of his character.
I think the lesson that Jimmy Hoffa learned from the Depression was to fight tooth and nail for everything you could get. Because big business and the government were not the friends of the working man.
His career thrived in large part in a very unregulated economy and political atmosphere in Detroit in the 1930s. He saw, in fact, that workers could succeed more often than not in that sort of jungle environment.
Rum runners and guys who were moving liquor into the country, they needed trucks. The teamsters were driving those trucks. You've got the nexus right there of the mob, corruption, and laborers. And when Prohibition ends, that connections remain, and it just grows out of that.
Often business owners would hire thugs with baseball bats and clubs and sometimes pistols to intimidate or beat union organizers. And quite often those union organizers would fight back with violence as well. And so many of these battles were fought in the streets.
Management and ownership, breaking promises and breaking legs, it is morally acceptable to fight fire with fire.
Yeah, I mean, the mob was muscle, and then the mob worked for whoever would hire them. And in terms of the organized labor movement, there were times when corporate America, whether it's the garment industry or whatever, would hire mob muscle to intimidate the unions. So it wasn't like the mobsters were embracing organized labor movement in America. The mobsters went wherever there was a payday.
And workers often found that they could win those conflicts. And in particular, Hoffa found that those conflicts could be settled through their willingness to fight in the streets.
For union rank and file, Jimmy Hoffa is a Robin Hood. And like Robin Hood, he may have to resort to extra legal acts. He may have to get his hands dirty. But in the end, his workers and these marginalized communities are better off.
Hoffa was most likely involved in car bombings. You had to keep scabs out of those workplaces. You had to keep replacement workers out, or else you had no power as a union leader.
The first real documented proof of Hoffa's connection with the mob comes in about 1937. Hoffa was married by this time, but he had an ex-girlfriend who was sort of a gangster moll, Sylvia Pagano, aka Sylvia Paris.
At the time, Pagano is dating Frankie Three Fingers Coppola, a bootlegger from Los Angeles who has a criminal record extending back to his youth in Sicily. Pagano introduces Coppola to Hoffa, and they become friends right away.
Frank Coppola associated with Santo Perone, a Detroit Sicilian mobster who was known for providing goons and muscle to either unions or to businesses, again playing both sides of the fence in various union battles in the 1930s.
They come up with a plan. The mob can provide muscle to back this union movement that is struggling. The odds are against them. The mob will offer access to muscle, to defend the workers, to counterattack.
The Teamsters at this time were engaged in a brutal strike with the Kroger supermarket chain, people being shot, heads being busted, and supposedly Hoffa asked his new friend Santo Perone to hold his goons back and not help Kroger while the Teamsters tried to fight this struggle.
The old adage about Hoffa was that he wound up going to the mob because he was trying to use them to go after stubborn employers who refused to be unionized. In fact, he used the mob to go after the CIO, which was raiding the Teamsters turf in Detroit.
I think Jimmy Hoffa used the Mafia and other organized crime the same way he used everybody else. He was always the smartest guy in the room, and I think to say that the mob controlled him or controlled the Teamsters is misleading.
There's no evidence that he was ever beholden to them. There's no evidence that they ever dominated his unions.
So I don't think someone like Jimmy Hoffa makes a decision that, well, I'm going to become a racketeer. Rather, it's an organic response. Hoffa has an opportunity here to secure some type of defense on behalf of his workers by forming various partnerships with members of the underworld.
Jimmy Hoffa recognized this is the way to go, this is the way to rise to the top, and you got to get in bed with these guys, and they're going to benefit and I'm going to benefit. Not complicated at all.
One of the most stunning claims about Hoffa and the Teamsters is that they were integral to the development of the global heroin trade. Teamster trucks and locals may have been used to help flood the United States with Sicilian heroin in the aftermath of World War II. And it all centered around Hoffa's first friend in the mob, Frank Coppola.
A number of congressional committee reports documented the relationship between Coppola and Hoffa and the Teamsters. Now, Coppola is a really interesting character. He's a bootlegger in Los Angeles. He is a human trafficker in Mexico. He's a labor racketeer in Detroit. He's running drugs out of Cuba. He's all over the place. The United States deports Coppola in 1948. Communist Party is popular in Italy. The labor unions are gaining strength in Italy. And the U.S. State Department has a very real concern that Italy will fall into communist hands. And back in Sicily, he's a political power broker. He has unique connections to Italian senators. His brother is a powerful member of the clergy in Sicily.
Even before the Nazis surrendered, the Cold War was beginning, and the U.S. government was making deals with criminals and former fascists in Europe to help fight a dirty war against communism. In Italy, this was known as Operation Gladio. Mafia boss of bosses Lucky Luciano was working with the U.S. government, and so was Jimmy Hoffa's old friend, Frank Coppola.
Coppola and Luciano got together and created a drug network. From Montreal, there were two routes. One was straight south into New York, where it was handled by a guy from the Bonanno crime family, a guy named Carmine Galante. And then across Canada, over the Detroit River into Detroit.
Congressional committee reports identified Preziola and Quasarano as two of the most significant and important drug traffickers in North America.
And Jimmy Hoffa, in order to give these guys a facade of legitimacy, he set up a dummy local for them, Teamsters local for them to operate out of.
And the evidence suggests that for quite some time, New York mafiosi were buying their heroin from the Detroit suppliers. Did Hoffa know about the narcotics trafficking? I can't prove that. I suspect that someone as smart as Hoffa would not want to know about what was going on. But I've interviewed retired federal agents from FBN, and they contend that within their offices it was well known that the Teamsters were protecting these drug traffickers.
In 1952, Dave Beck became the new president of the Teamsters, and Jimmy Hoffa became vice president. This was the peak moment for the union movement in the United States. The most members, the strongest voice, the most power.
And government leaders and business leaders both wanted to curb that. They wanted to curb the union movement. And it's crucial to understand that that period coincided with the rise in labor regulation, especially from the federal government. So in the 30s, when Hoffa was coming up, he was faced with constant competition from other unions, which forced him to be militant and accountable to his members. It forced him to be a good union leader. By the 1950s, it was all but impossible for unions to compete against one another.
So now, with no outside elements left to fight, Jimmy Hoffa turns his attentions inward. He goes after his own president, Dave Beck. And Hoffa makes a deal with some really bad people, including a New York racketeer named Johnny Dio. Dio was infamous. He had been implicated in an acid attack on crusading journalist Victor Riesel, where acid was thrown in his face and he was blinded permanently.
Did the American labor movement go off track to a certain degree? Sure it did. But did corporate America go off track? Sure it did. It's almost a human condition. When you've got that much power, that much status, that much wealth.
So meanwhile, Hoffa has an unyet known nemesis crisscrossing the country, trying to bring him down, Bobby Kennedy, who's working for John McClellan, a senator running a Senate investigation into labor and union corruption.
The McClellan hearings was also a means through which to attack the union movement in terms of public relations. That the movement was full of goons and criminals, people like Jimmy Hoffa, and that's really the purpose it served.
Hoffa knew he was next to be called in front of the Senate, but he had a plan. He tried to plant a spy right inside Bobby Kennedy's office.
Hoffa, trying to keep tabs on what the Senate committee was doing, was introduced to a guy named John Cy Cheasty. Well, Cheasty was an honest guy, and he went to Bobby Kennedy's people and he said, listen, Jimmy Hoffa's come to me and made me this offer.
So Kennedy and Cheasty set Hoffa up. When he goes to pass the money off to Cheasty, the FBI is there to arrest him.
He gives the documents to Jimmy Hoffa. Jimmy Hoffa gives him the money. And this is all memorialized on film. And Hoffa's indicted, charged with extortion.
He was represented by Edward Bennett Williams, who was the premier criminal defense attorney in America. He arranged to have, he being Williams, arranged to have Joe Louis sit in the front row, and when the jury selection was going on, he shook hands with Joe Louis, and it's difficult again today to go back to realize what a symbol to the African American community Joe Louis was in the 50s and the 60s. And this was a carefully orchestrated event to give Jimmy Hoffa some credibility.
The jury comes out, and sure enough, Jimmy Hoffa's acquitted.
August of '57, fresh off his victory at trial, Jimmy Hoffa is finally called in front of the McClellan Committee on Labor Corruption, and he and Bobby Kennedy go at it.
The hatred between Bobby Kennedy and Jimmy Hoffa was of mythical proportions.
Kennedy really had a paternalist image of the world. He was a wealthy boy who was raised with this idea of noblesse oblige, the idea that the wealthy are obligated to help their lessers. He had to remove the dictators who were oppressing the people of the third world. He had to remove the dictators from within the unions who were oppressing the working class, like Jimmy Hoffa.
I think Bobby Kennedy saw all this as a chance to get himself some national exposure, probably at his father Joe Kennedy's suggestion. By creating a mythology of Hoffa being so dangerous to America, a tactic he learned at the feet of Joe McCarthy, who was actually a family friend of the Kennedys, he made himself into a hero, protecting America from the bad men like Jimmy Hoffa.
Bobby Kennedy thought that Jimmy Hoffa was an enemy of Orthodox society. He believed that with Hoffa having the ability to shut down this country with his control over the trucking union, that he was a national security threat. And he believed that Hoffa's association with organized crime just quadrupled the threat to this country. Consequently, Jimmy Hoffa was a person who had to be stopped.
He was also a very Christian man, with the idea that the holy should save and redeem and uplift those who have not been saved. He saw the whole world as a group of people inferior to himself who needed to be raised to his level.
I don't think Hoffa ever viewed himself as a racketeer. In fact, to the extent that he acknowledged his relationships with the underworld, he was actually unapologetic about it.
Did you say that SOB, I'll break his back? Who? You.
Others were such rising stars on the political scene at such a young age.
The federal government really had no business in intervening in that, but Bobby Kennedy saw to it anyway, and in many ways, he and the Democratic leadership with the CIO leadership really put a web of constraints around the labor movement that destroyed labor activism.
Some of his close associates claim he would write a check to the Boston Archdiocese, say for $1 million. The Archdiocese would take $900,000 in cash from the parishioners' contributions and give it to Kennedy. Kennedy then could write off his $1 million donation, and he had $900,000 in cash to pass around in grease palms to help his two sons get elected. So it must have been a real bitter pill for Jimmy Hoffa to swallow, to sit in front of that Senate committee and be browbeaten by the likes of the son of Joe Kennedy. The hearings eventually ended, and Teamster President Dave Beck got indicted and sent to prison, and Jimmy Hoffa became Teamster's president. So now Jimmy Hoffa has the power, and it's time to pay back the people who helped him get there. And one of the ways he could do that was with the Teamsters Pension Fund,
which was operated by a hastily thrown together insurance company called Union Casualty, which was run by a guy named Paul Dorfman and his son Alan Dorfman.
Huge amounts of the Las Vegas Strip were financed with loans from the Central State Pension Fund, which was under the control of Jimmy Hoffa.
the Tropicana, the Circus, the Aladdin, Caesar's
all true. It is also true their pensions were tremendous. They were much higher than they would have been had Hoffa not existed. Even during his corrupt phase, they were getting very wealthy pensions. They were getting wages that were far higher than truck drivers were making 20 years earlier.
Nobody in this country respects what's weak. You believe me. But because we are financially solid, because we do have an organization that is equipped to handle any situation that comes in front of us, we're successful in getting from the employers what our members want and need without strikes.
Chicago, Cleveland, Kansas City, they would whack the money up depending on which mob families had a piece of that particular casino. The number varies from 12 million to 20 million a year, from 6 casinos to 10 casinos, however many.
The Jewish Dorfman was a towering figure in organized crime and wasn't afraid of violence.
I got an anonymous call to meet a source who was going to give me information about Dorfman. Broad daylight, public place. I didn't even hesitate to go. And I got jumped there, and I got really, it was the worst beating I've ever taken.
A lot of them were prosecuted. A lot of the guys who were involved in this were indicted and went to jail. But it was all about cooking the books.
The story of Alan Dorfman in Las Vegas was dramatized in Martin Scorsese's movie Casino, and Dorfman himself was gunned down in Chicago in the early 1980s.
Here in Chicago this afternoon, Alan Dorfman, a man with reported ties to organized crime and to the Teamsters Union for the past 30 years, was shot to death in what police are describing as a gangland-style execution.
Dorfman died here in a suburban Chicago parking lot from as many as 7 .22 caliber gunshot wounds to the head.
Dorfman was about to go to prison for his conviction last month in the Teamsters bribery conspiracy trial.
From his stronghold in the wild Sierra Maestre Mountains, Cuba's Fidel Castro emerged triumphant after 2 years of guerrilla warfare against the Batista regime.
In the late 50s, Jimmy Hoffa got himself mixed up in the deepest levels of America's secret politics. When Fidel Castro seized power in Cuba, Dwight Eisenhower told the CIA to kill him. But of course, this was easier said than done because the hit could never be linked back to the US government. So, unbelievably, the CIA contacted the Mafia to help them kill Fidel Castro. Mob bosses like Santos Trafficante, Carlos Marcello, and Meyer Lansky had lost tens of millions of dollars when Castro seized power, and they were the ones that had the connections to the Cuban exile community that could help the CIA get poison in or get an assassin in and take Castro out. The CIA's first contact with the mob may well have been through Jimmy Hoffa. During this time, Hoffa's right-hand man, Roland McMaster, a high-ranking Teamster official, went down to Florida, set up a Teamster office in Miami, which was full of Cuban exiles, was a hotbed of anti-Castro activity, and right inside the Teamster office in Miami, Santo Trafficante, one of the most powerful mob bosses in the country, had an office.
A guy named Bob Mayhew came in, was brought into the plots by the head of covert operations for the Central Intelligence Agency.
Robert Mayhew, incidentally, was close friends and business partners with Jimmy Hoffa's old lawyer, Edward Bennett Williams, and shared office space with him back in Washington, D.C.
You know, I interviewed Mayhew just a few blocks from here at the Georgetown Inn here in Washington. He told me that his job was to get to Santo Trafficante, who had been released from the Cuban prison after he had been imprisoned by Castro in April of '59. But Mayhew didn't know Trafficante. He knew that it was going to take a boss to deal with another boss, but he didn't know a boss. But he did know a guy named Johnny Roselli. And so Bob Mayhew worked with Johnny Roselli, who brought in, Johnny Roselli was a Chicago gangster, and so he brings in Sam Giancana, who at the time was kind of the acting boss in Chicago, and it was Sam Giancana who brings in Santo Trafficante into what becomes the CIA Mafia plots to kill Castro. But we have evidence of the fact that Jimmy Hoffa was the original liaison between the CIA and the Mafia and the Castro assassination plots during that period between December of 1959 and August of 1960, when Bob Mayhew became involved in those plots.
While the CIA mob plots to kill Castro obviously failed, they did have profound consequences, which likely culminated in the murder of President Kennedy in Dallas in 1963. The CIA's bungled maneuvering had created a dangerous nexus of players, ranging from Hoffa and the Teamsters to Cuban dissidents, mob bosses, and fringe characters like Lee Harvey Oswald.
So when Bobby Kennedy became Attorney General, he had a hit list of organized crime figures and their associates whom he had targeted for prosecution. And number one on that hit list was Jimmy Hoffa.
Dan Moldia wrote the seminal book on Hoffa and the Teamsters right in the immediate aftermath of Hoffa's disappearance. And he's convinced that New Orleans mob boss Carlos Marcello, who'd had his own run-ins with Bobby Kennedy, conspired with Hoffa and others to somehow manipulate Lee Harvey Oswald into killing JFK, and then had Mafia associate Jack Ruby kill Oswald before he could spill the story.
He's been shot. He's been shot. Lee Oswald has been shot.
That the murder of John Kennedy is a straight mob hit. Jimmy Hoffa, Carlos Marcello, Santo Trafficante arrange and execute the murder.
Marcello, Hoffa, and Trafficante did share the same lawyer, a guy named Frank Regano, who made the claim years later, when he was trying to sell a book, that Hoffa had him carry the contract to kill JFK to Marcello and Trafficante.
The mob guys were absolutely horrified as to what was going on, saying that they were going to have to go back to Europe just to feed themselves, that Bobby Kennedy was just destroying their businesses, that they would die themselves if they could get rid of Bobby Kennedy as Attorney General.
I think the Kennedys were definitely playing both sides of the fence when it came to organized crime. The FBI actually recorded a wiretap between Chicago mobsters Sam Giancana and Johnny Rosselli that their donation to JFK's campaign had been accepted, but that Bobby Kennedy wouldn't let up on them and their friends. It was his fourth criminal trial in 10 years, but this time Bobby Kennedy had a new trick up his sleeve. He had a mole inside Hoffa's camp that was feeding him information as the trial was going on.
The person who ended up being the key government witness against Jimmy Hoffa was a guy named Ed Grady Parton from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, Local 5. He was a Teamster official. And Ed Parton had knowledge of the fixing of the jury. In fact, when he called the Justice Department and spoke with Walter Sheridan, who was the head of Bobby Kennedy's Get Hoffa squad, he said flat out, Hoffa's fixing to fix the jury.
The problem with all this was Ed Parton himself. Parton supplied Kennedy with the inside info to convict Hoffa on jury tampering, but Parton was a guy who'd been arrested for everything from manslaughter to embezzling union funds, and he was actually out on bail for those crimes when he miraculously saw the light and decided to help get Hoffa.
And one of the reasons why Ed Parton had stepped forward was because Jimmy Hoffa had told him that he was planning to kill Bobby Kennedy. When Walter Sheridan heard this information, they immediately put him on a polygraph, not just about the jury tampering business, but about the plot to murder Bobby Kennedy. Florida, was talking to another FBI informant named Jose Alamán. And he made it clear that it was Jimmy Hoffa who was making the arrangements for the president's murder.
In the weeks leading up to Kennedy and Oswald's murders, Jack Ruby had numerous phone calls with people like Teamster enforcer Barney Baker, who was suspected in many murders and had worked personally for Hoffa and Meyer Lansky. So, was Jimmy Hoffa involved in the plot to kill JFK? The Church Committee, which was a Senate investigation looking into U.S. intelligence operations, determined that Hoffa had the means, motive, and opportunity to help kill John F. Kennedy. But that doesn't mean he did.
It was determined that Hoffa had tampered with a member of the jury. And so he was re-indicted on charges of jury tampering, for which he received an 8-year sentence. He was convicted on a second case in Chicago involving pension fraud, where he received another 5 years. So he was given a 13-year prison sentence.
With his raincoat covering handcuffs, Hoffa arrives at federal prison in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. He said his attorneys would continue his fight while he's in jail. Parole is possible in 32 months. At $100,000 annually, he's the nation's highest paid prisoner.
So Jimmy Hoffa gets sent to Lewisburg Federal Prison. Things get even more complicated for Hoffa there because he's housed with Genovese mob captain Tony Provenzano, who was also the president of a huge Teamster local in New Jersey at the time. And the two of them actually got into a fist fight with Hoffa yelling, "It's guys like you that got me in here in the first place." At the time all this is going on in prison, a national mob war is brewing out in the real world.
1964, 65, 66 was the Banana Wars. Joe Bonanno's son, Bill Bonanno, deciding to whack 3 of the heads of the 5 families. Joe Bonanno wound up in Tucson, Arizona. And in Tucson, Arizona, he made a pact with 2 Southern organized crime figures. One was Carlos Marcello, the Mafia boss of New Orleans, and the other was Santo Trafficante of Tampa.
If the Bonanno, Marcello, Trafficante Southern powers could control Hoffa, they probably could control the single biggest prize in the country, the Teamster Pension Fund, which was really the goose that was laying golden egg after golden egg. Ultimately, the Mafia Commission patched up the rift between the Mafia families, and Jimmy Hoffa was left on the outside looking in, but now with a new deadly enemy in the form of Anthony Tony Provenzano.
A murderer upstairs or a man with 50 years alongside of you. And when you're trying to sleep under those conditions, unless you have a tremendous willpower, you're constantly with one eye open, looking to see whether or not you'll survive the night for the next day.
From the 1930s through the 1970s, most unions were giving their campaign money to Democrats. Hoffa gave his money to whomever would help the Teamsters and himself. And so sometimes he gave his money to Democrats, sometimes to Republicans. By the early 1970s, when he was in prison, Richard Nixon was president, and it became quite convenient for the Teamster to give money to Nixon and the Republicans, and in exchange, he received a pardon.
Well, I appreciate the fact that he signed the commutation papers. Whatever effect will have on the members, I can't say. I haven't talked to any members.
Do you regard this as a strictly political move?
No, I do not. I think it was a regular routine commutation based upon my time served, based upon my sentence, and the background of the sentence.
Do you plan on supporting Nixon because he's doing this, or what?
It's too far away to make any predictions of what I will do politically.
And why would Nixon do that? And if Hoffa was this terrible organized labor figure / gangster, why is he entitled to a pardon? Those kind of things were all questions back then. It certainly undermined Nixon to a great degree. I mean, that was one of the many things that when people started to talk about Nixon as a president who didn't play by the rules, Nixon as a president who ultimately became the paranoid president. This was an example of that. This was Nixon the deal maker.
While Jimmy Hoffa was in prison from 67 to 71, America changed a lot. And when he got out, Hoffa's time had really passed in a lot of ways.
Hoffa, for one segment of the American population, epitomized organized labor, working for the blue collar, the common man, giving him his rights, giving him decent wages and working conditions. But for the people that were involved in the protests of the 1960s that wanted change, that were progressive, that were liberal, organized labor had become, in a lot of ways, part of the problem. I mean, the sons and daughters of blue-collar workers who had gone on to get an education kind of looked askance at all of that. They didn't appreciate what unions really were about. What they saw were unions corrupting the system. And I think Hoffa epitomized that to them. On the other hand, he epitomized the champion for the common man, for the earlier generation of workers.
Teamster Vice President Frank Fitzsimmons was running the Teamster show with Hoffa away in prison, and he was even more accommodating than Hoffa had been to organized crime.
But Fitzsimmons just allowed everyone to do their thing. That's the way he liked it. And that's the way the vice presidents liked it, and that's the way the mob liked it.
This union nor I am in the hands of organized crime. This union has nothing to hide on the general presidency of Frank Fitzsimmons.
Many of these guys had feathered their own personal nests pretty well during the Fitzsimmons tenure.
And the only thing that he was looking at that point was trying to get back into a leadership position with a union who didn't seem to want him around anymore.
He really only had one thing on his mind, which was claiming back the Teamsters presidency. This was his baby, his joy in life was being the president of the Teamsters.
Even though he had been involved with organized crime, he always figured it was a 50-50 relationship where he was getting things from them and returning for giving things to them, not only personally but for the labor movement. He thought that Frank Fitzsimmons had become a lackey for the members of organized crime, and he was very interested in getting back into the Teamsters Union. He was going to do whatever he could to get his power back, and if that involved agreeing to or deciding to take some of the mob influence out of the union, Hoffa was willing to do that to get the power back.
Hoffa's desperation reached a point where my sources in the federal government tell me that he actually became an FBI informant. This is a well-kept secret in the fact that it really hasn't been public record, but that Hoffa was actually a full-fledged informant by the end. There was an actual quid pro quo between Hoffa and his handlers in the federal government and the FBI that in exchange for Hoffa feeding them information about what he knew, the FBI, the federal government, was going to help lift the restriction on Hoffa's ability to run for the presidency of the Teamsters, and that he would be allowed to run in 1976. The word on the street was that Hoffa's restriction was most likely to be lifted was really a problem for the mob, in the sense that they realized that Hoffa had enough support and enough momentum behind him that he could easily win that 1976 election.
From Machiavelli, fortune favors the bold. He was going to make a bold move to try to come back. But I think there were just too many players involved, too many people who didn't want him to come back, and he couldn't control all the events and all the players, as he could have maybe 20 years earlier when he was at the peak of his power in the Teamsters Union.
So Hoffa's relationship with the Mafia is quickly deteriorating. His really only life raft at this point are the Giacalone brothers, Anthony Tony Jack Giacalone and Vito Billy Jack Giacalone, the street bosses of the Detroit Mafia, the men that are really the faces of organized crime in Detroit. They do all the dirty work, they're the junkyard dogs, and they have long been Hoffa's contacts.
The Detroit family goes way back. I mean, it's one of the original families. It's part of the commission, part of the National Commission.
Through my years of undercover work, I don't believe that I was ever able to really penetrate the mob, the Detroit Mafia, if you will. These people had charisma. Some of them were very likable people. I think they were friendly, but from a distance, from afar. They were not the kind of people that would take a shining to strangers as part of their culture, their makeup. They don't deal with strangers.
The mob knew the only way to get Hoffa out in the open was to lure him, and that lure was Tony Provenzano. Hoffa understood the only way that he was going to get the requisite number of delegates to take back the Teamsters Union in the '76 election was to make peace with Tony Provenzano, a man that he had actually put into power in the union, was very good friends with until they had a rather bitter falling out in prison. Hoffa knew he had to squash the beef. The Giacalones knew that bringing Tony Provenzano to Detroit as a lure would be the way to get Hoffa out in the open, because Hoffa needed that support.
I mean, there was a saying in Detroit that if you didn't know that person when he was sucking his mama's breast, stay away from him, don't trust him. And that's the way they acted. They grew up together, they socialized together, they married one another, and they died together. Insulated, protected group by themselves.
It was appropriate in Hoffa's mind that Giacalone would be acting as the go-between. Tony Provenzano's first cousin was Tony Giacaloni's wife, where the Giacaloni brothers were actually going to his house, I believe, on July 26th and July 27th, trying to get Hoffa to come out of hiding, if you will. He was very cautious about who he was dealing with out in the public, and they also wanted to ease his worries that he was in danger. Well, in fact, he was in danger, but the Giacalonis were playing, according to witnesses, was occupied by 3 men. 2 men in the front seat and 1 in the back. Hoffa is seen getting into this car, and the car is seen driving away onto Telegraph Road, never to be seen again. And with this disappearance really started arguably the most fascinating mystery in the criminal annals of America.
The most prominent labor leader in America just disappears and nobody saw anything. Even though his wife was concerned and was calling people, nobody was overly concerned about an adult male not coming home at 5, 6, 7, 8 o'clock at night. I mean, that's been known to happen.
The Hoffas are reportedly under heavy guard here. But late this afternoon, the family broke its silence and asked for public assistance in the search for Jimmy Hoffa.
I have asked anybody who might have information concerning my father's whereabouts to please come forward.
Agents in the organized crime units in every major city, but particularly New York, New Jersey, Detroit, Chicago, Boston, were all taking every effort they could to establish any connection or any interaction between the cities. These were almost all face-to-face meetings in private settings.
I remember the time period. People were running around with shovels, digging holes in fields all around Metro Detroit.
The whole experience when I first got to Detroit is, this is just like the movies. You know, I'd always wanted to be an FBI agent, and now it seemed like you were going from one major case to another.
All of these whack job, nutty people would call me. And I finally got to the point with people when they called me who told me where he was. I just said, go get a shovel, go dig a hole. If you find anything, call me before you call the FBI.
I think the feeling was that, you know, that we're going to throw all our resources at this, and our history is such that, generally speaking, you know, we get to the bottom of it.
According to spokesman for the Organized Crime Strike Force, there will be a major announcement concerning the Hoffa case by the end of this week.
I mean, I believe these guys were smarter than we sometimes give them credit for. And I think that when they picked the people that were going to get rid of Jimmy Hoffa, they picked people who they were 100% sure would never reveal what they had done. You know, they knew how they were going to get rid of the body before they whacked him. I mean, there's no doubt in my mind about that. So they weren't driving around looking for a place to go. They weren't going to say, you know, let's put him in this temporary space and then we're going to move him. They clearly had plenty of time to do anything they wanted with the remains of Jimmy Hoffa between the time they left the Marcus Red Fox and the time anybody fully started looking, which was 10, 11, 12 o'clock the following day. I believe this thing was planned out with precision. They knew who was going to do it, they knew how they were going to kill him, and they knew where they were going to dispose of the body.
The reputation of Anthony Giacaloni was that he was a brilliant man who could have run one of the big 3, that he was that smart.
Feared by the average person and well known to the media. He had a very imposing personal presence. At that point, he was notorious for dressing in a very flashy style.
He was a man of very few words, but was someone with just the nod of his head could make things happen, such as people disappearing.
The Giacalonis, Joseph Giacaloni and Vito Giacaloni, were in yesterday, but speculation as to when you might be calling Anthony Giacaloni.
You're going to have to continue to speculate. I wish I could help you, but you know that I can.
Client pled the fifth or not, Mr. Early?
I can only assume he did. I advised him to do that. He was only in there a short minute or two, and he came out. I didn't ask him the question. I assume he did.
You have no idea what kind of questions may have been put to him there?
I doubt if they got past his name and address.
Tony Giacaloni that day shows up at the Southfield Athletic Club, spends the entire day at the Southfield Athletic Club. He was known by many people to be a very sort of surly, taciturn kind of guy, but he must have asked 50 people at the Southfield Athletic Club, they said, what time is it now? You got the time? You got the time?
Never talked to anybody they didn't need to talk to, especially didn't talk to regular civilians on a regular basis. He was going around shaking everyone's hand, asking people what time it was, how their day was going, to establish an alibi for himself. According to FBI surveillance record, Jack Tocco, the acting boss of the Detroit family at that time, came from Macomb County to Oakland County to meet with Giacalone. Giacalone and Tocco were not very close. They did not meet face-to-face very often. The fact that Tocco was coming to Oakland County, coming to South Athletic Club that afternoon, really told the FBI and investigators that something very important had just happened. Chucky O'Brien was a surrogate son, if you will, to Jimmy Hoffa. He was also very close to Tony Giacalone. His mother, Sylvia Pagano, was a bit of a gun mole, one of those women that kind of got passed around the mob. She had affairs with several members of organized crime in Detroit, two of them being Jimmy Hoffa and Tony Giacalone. He had had a falling out with Jimmy Hoffa and had really aligned with Tony Giacalone.
After my client's full cooperation with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Michigan State Police, and the Bloomfield Township Police, for a total of nearly 8 hours of intensive interviewing on an entirely voluntary basis, I am surprised and somewhat chagrined, as a matter of fact, that the government now feels compelled to make further inquiry of Mr. O'Brien.
Do you expect to see your father again?
I'm praying.
O'Brien was said to have been in possession of Giacalone's son, Joey's car that afternoon, the car that the FBI and investigators believe Hoffa was kidnapped in.
Why was he using a Giacalone O'Brien? Why would they ask to borrow anybody's car? You know, have some guy steal a car and give it to you through 3 layers of removal, and then you pick it up. These guys wouldn't have trouble getting a car.
You know, the Hoffa memo says that he was basically incompetent and a liar. Why didn't they kill O'Brien afterward? Why would they leave him alive? Why would they leave any of these guys alive?
I don't believe that the organized crime members that set this hit up would use Chucky O'Brien in any way, shape, or form other than very, very menial tasks. And frankly, being the one to drive Hoffa to his murder destination is not a menial task.
Tony Pro was a capo in the Genovese crime family. And the Genovese crime family, in my estimation, was the most powerful, the most well-run, and the most organized of the 5 New York families. Tony Pro controlled Teamsters Local 560 out of North Jersey.
Today, Provenzano acknowledged Hoffa was an old friend, but he said he hadn't seen him in years and could shed no light on Hoffa's disappearance.
Were you supposed to meet with Hoffa today? No, nothing. Not whatsoever, no.
Did you manage to finish testimony before?
Yes, we did. Yes, we did, Woody.
Why so brief, sir?
It wasn't that brief.
No?
They asked questions and we gave answers.
All this afternoon.
I don't believe that we would serve any worthy purpose to discuss out here on the street what transpired in the grand jury room. They have a job to do and they're doing their very best, and we wish them luck.
We knew there was an eyewitness who had kind of, but not quite, identified Sal Bergoglio.
His problem was that he had read newspaper accounts, and he was, I think he was trying to sort of help the FBI along rather than simply being an untainted witness. But the problem was they didn't know if his information was coming from news reports or whether it was untainted information that he had witnessed.
Bergoglio was an old school grizzled gangster that really looked the part and someone that really didn't flash a smile that much. It's a wide belief that Bergoglio and Vendetta were sent by Provenzano to Detroit to be his representatives on the Hoffa hit.
We knew that a guy named Ralph Picardo was telling the FBI what they knew about Jimmy Hoffa's murder. According to Ralph Picardo, Hoffa stuffed into a 55-gallon drum and shipped via gateway transportation truck to an unknown destination.
And this is what the FBI's initial understanding of the case was.
So you have Russell Buffalino, who's the acting head of the Genovese crime family. You have Tony Provenzano, who's a capo in the Genovese crime family. And then you have his guys, Sal Bergoglio, Gabe Bergoglio, Tommy Andretta, Stevie Andretta, being the guys who were actually the mechanics in this operation.
You know, two people can keep a secret if one is dead. There isn't a want or a need for information, then they don't know about it or want to know about it for that very purpose.
Does it make any sense that you would carry Jimmy Hoffa around in a 55-gallon barrel when you could just simply take him to central sanitation and dispose of the body? I think that that's where the feds eventually landed on that.
And he said, just bottom line, it makes no sense at all. You don't kill somebody and then cart their body across country. Nobody in the underworld's going to do that kind of stuff.
Well, the next day I pick up the phone, I call Sal Bergoglio up and ask for him at local 560. He gets on the phone, he says, yeah, who's this? And I said, my name's Dan Moldea. And he says, what do you need? And I said, I'm a journalist and I'd like to come and talk to you. He says, well, what do you want to talk about? I said, the Hoffa disappearance. He goes, what makes you think I have anything to say about that? And I said, because, Mr. Bergoglio, you've neither been indicted nor arrested. And the entire world is saying that you killed Jimmy Hoffa. And the government is putting this information out. And I think the government might be violating your civil rights.
We are innocent, we're presumed to be innocent, we remain innocent.
But you must theorize on why the government's doing this to you. And this goes back
to
to how
they're a bunch of motherfuckers.
the possibility of Hoffa's body being stuffed in a 55-gallon drum, pickled, maybe put in a liquid preservative.
Well, now what the hell, would you ever pickle anybody and preserve them? Let's assume, put yourself in the position of the bad guy.
And I think if I
would you try to preserve them? Two fellows out of Chicago met their maker through at the expense of at the hands of the CIA because of testimony.
And Gene Connor?
Yeah, Roselli and John Connor. Now, you'd be better off asking the CIA to investigate the FBI, and the FBI to investigate the CIA, and then there you'd have the answer.
This guy was a giant. He was a big guy. Had a glass eye, too. One eye would be following you wherever you went, and the other eye was just staring straight at it into the distance. He was a scary guy.
McMaster was a larger-than-life character, both physically and story-wise. He was a business agent for the Teamsters. He was involved in union activities, organizing, getting union votes. He probably weighed 300 pounds and was 6'6" or 6'7", huge hands. Personally an intimidating guy, and I think if you wanted to send a message to people to physically intimidate them, Roland McMaster was a guy who, if he showed up at your door, probably generated that kind of reaction.
I mean, McMaster was working with Santo Trafficani down in Miami, for sure. McMaster was part of the Cuban process. McMaster knew a lot of stuff. A lot of people viewed McMaster as a knuckle dragger. This guy was a sharp guy.
I tend to agree with him that Roland McMaster could have played a role in the assassination. He was one of the most trusted non-Italian union, non-mob union members, and someone that had a lot of knowledge of past union mob relationship, union mob wrongdoing.
Because I was convinced that Roland McMaster and his zombie stooges who worked for him were somehow involved in Jimmy Hoffa's murder and probably responsible for the disposal of Jimmy Hoffa's body. I believe that. I got a call on that on August 4th, 1975. That's 5 days after Jimmy Hoffa's, and I have not moved from that position since then. Everything I have seen and heard reinforces everything I believe.
There was a lot of violence going on in the Teamsters in the months leading up to Hoffa's disappearance. Dan Moldea believes that Roland was involved, deeply involved, and probably knew what happened to Hoffa.
Hoffa people being under siege, where their houses were being bombed, their boats were being bombed. You had people being shot.
People today don't realize bombings of businesses and union officials' cars and these kinds of things were much more common occurrence.
The real action is right here in Detroit. This is where it's all happening. This local 299 violence is a big story, and everybody is ignoring it.
He was going after this story full bore. He was willing to put himself in harm's way to get the book.
There was one guy who was so upset about McMaster that I was asking questions about, and this is a Hoffa guy. This is a guy I felt comfortable with. The guy pulls a gun out and sticks it in my mouth. Yeah, sticks the fucking gun in my mouth.
Less than 2 months before Hoffa disappeared, little Fitz, Richard Fitzsimmons, the son of Frank Fitzsimmons, the current Teamsters president, had his car blown out in the parking lot of Nemo's, a popular tavern right by the 250 local. There was a lot of people that believed that Hoffa set that bomb to try to kill Fitz and little Fitz. There are other people that believe that there were actual Teamster goons that set that bomb in that car to make it look like Hoffa was trying to kill the Fitzsimmons and in return would get Hoffa killed.
Teamster President Frank Fitzsimmons is now a principal figure in the investigation of the disappearance of James Hoffa. But federal agents on the Hoffa case are now taking a very close look at Fitzsimmons' activities just before and just after Hoffa disappeared.
It's impossible to believe that the guys who are behind all of this Local 299 violence, which goes right up until 20 days before Hoffa disappears with the bombing of Dick Fitzsimmons' car, and that these guys aren't involved in the denouement when Jimmy Hoffa disappears on July 30th? You know, please.
On the other hand, you look at it and you say to yourself, well, the Mafia families in New York and Detroit, you know, they had a long list of very, very established and well-honed executioners, hitmen, if you will. And it makes you think, well, why would they bring in a guy like McMaster when they have so many, guys that can do the job in their own backyard?
They wouldn't have had trouble finding a house or a location to do whatever they wanted to do. And I don't think they would leave it on a piece of property they owned or in the barn on Roland McMaster's property, unless they were trying to frame Roland McMaster.
We broke the story
Climbs in a small private plane and they fly to Detroit and they land at the Pontiac airport. Sharon gets in a car that's waiting for him, drives to this location, picks up a couple of guys, goes up to the Marcus Red Fox to get Jimmy, bring him back, and Sharon kills him. But I had a pilot tell me you can't just fly a private plane to Pontiac Metro Airport. You gotta get around the air traffic area. And he found his story to be a little improbable.
Or you're going to get somebody like Frank Sheeran, who, also claims to have been involved in the murder of Joey Gallo, and also claims to have provided the guns that were used in the Kennedy assassination. Well, if those things are true, this guy stayed under the radar for a very, very long time, and it's kind of hard to believe.
They heard that Sheeran was writing a book, and they wanted to bring me on as a consultant about Sheeran. But then that one fell apart, because they just caught him in so many lies. And apparently Maria Shriver had done the interview. Once again, they're going to bring me on as a consultant, and once again, Sheeran's lies just caused the whole thing to fall apart. In 2001, he says Sal Bergoglio's the killer. Then 2003, when Dateline NBC calls me, there's one different thing. And I said, what's that? He says, Sheeran's now claiming that he is the killer. And I'm going, he's saying himself that he did the job? And he said, yeah. He says, what's more valuable, a book by a guy who was there or a book by a guy who actually pulled the trigger?
I don't know. What motivates a guy to make up the story that says he killed Hoffa before he died? Well, these guys don't think the way the rest of us do.
I mean, Sheeran was mostly concerned about the money because he was going to die and he was broke and he needed to leave some money to his family.
Well, I never bought the Frank Sheeran story. I mean, if you're the Mafia, all right, if you're organized crime and you're going to kill a person like Jimmy Hoffa, kidnap and kill him, why would you bring in a guy who's not part of your organization, who's not subject to the rules and discipline, who hasn't agreed to what you believe in? Why would you bring in somebody from the outside? They certainly had more than enough people capable and in the government's opinion, more than enough people who've murdered people in the past. There's no need to go outside and find anybody else.
I have a hard time believing his story strictly based on the fact of where he claims the murder took place. He claims it took place off 7 Mile in Detroit on a street named Beaverland, which would be a good 20, 25-minute drive from the Marcus Red Fox. And it's a house that he can't source to anybody. He can't claim whose house it was or why they took him there.
There was a DNA analysis done of the bloodstains found in the entrance of the house. They proved not to be Hoffa, which was really disappointing to a lot of us.
That conversation, which was used at the trial, Tony Palazzolo pointed to the auger, which was enormous, and he said, that's where Jimmy Hoffa is, or was. That's where we put him. And that is where I believe Jimmy Hoffa went. I think he was ground up, churned up, and put in sausage or otherwise.
Tony Palazzolo is definitely known as someone that was looked at as a possible participant in the Hoffa hit. He is someone that is currently in the 2000s a Detroit mob captain, but at the time of the disappearance was a up-and-coming young buck in the mob that had made his name as a bodyguard and driver for Pete Bozzy Vitale. The Vitales are another group of mobsters that had a lot of close ties with Jimmy Hoffa and the Teamsters. The fact that Tony Palazzolo might have been involved in this is frankly very easy to believe.
How did they get Jimmy into a car when he was at the Red Fox, supposedly meeting Tony Giacalone? If he goes to see some, who went to meet him? Who was there to pick him up? And who was there to explain why he couldn't go with Tony Giacalone? Billy Giacalone, whose whereabouts on that day are certainly not nearly as well known as his brothers. If Billy had said, hey, look, Jimmy, Tony can't make it, he's here or there, let's get in the car.
And I know Vito Giacalone's in this thing. This Vito Giacalone is right in the middle of this whole thing. I just can't figure out exactly where he is.
The state police had been following Billy Giacalone around that week that Hoffa disappeared. They went out that morning that Hoffa disappeared looking for him, and they couldn't find him, and nobody saw him all day. So that tells me that he was probably there as the Detroit representative.
I believe, after talking to numerous sources, both in the FBI and on the street itself, guys that are actually in the mob, I believe that Hoffa was taken less than 2 miles away to the house of Carlo Licata. Licata was a Detroit mob member, a mob soldier, who was the brother-in-law of Jack and Tony Tocco. Licata's house was less than a 5-minute drive from the Marcus Red Fox. Licata's house was also a place that Hoffa had been to meet the Giacalones on several occasions before. It was a house that was used as a meeting point. Licata himself was a trusted member of the family, related to the administration, as well as the house was almost a perfect location in the sense that it was back on a hill, removed from the road.
We think that he probably went to Licata's house that wasn't too far.
And I think they got him in the house, and I think Billy Giacalone was probably there. I think somebody like Andretti's, Bergoglio's, somebody like that was there, and he was killed. And then he was taken and disposed of pretty quickly.
We think that they disposed of the body by taking it to the sanitation place where they had contacts.
I'm convinced that within a half hour to an hour of Hoffa breathing his last breath, that he was incinerated, that the body ceases to exist, and the ability to get rid of the body was incredible with the Detroit mob, in the sense that they had 3 separate sanitation companies, all owned by mob members, and the one that everyone looks at, primarily Central Sanitation, was owned by Jimmy Quazzarano, Paul and Peter Vitale, and Carlo Licata.
There are a number of people, I think Central Sanitation, the facility, played a role in the disappearance of the body.
House of 2 gunshot wounds to the chest. It was ruled a suicide, but there are a lot of people, both on the street and in law enforcement, that believe this was anything but a suicide, that this was a message.
And obviously Mr. Licata met his demise in not what is generally considered to be a pedestrian manner.
Anyone that would even consider giving information about the Hoffa hit, no matter how close they are to the leaders of the mob, they will be sacrificed.
The report names Carlos Marcello and Santo Trafficante as the most likely organized crime bosses to have been involved. It provides evidence, some of it inconclusive, that they and Teamster leader Jimmy Hoffa threatened John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, or both. Further, it suggests associations through which they could have influenced accused assassin Lee Harvey Oswald or Oswald's killer, Jack Ruby. Teamster boss Hoffa threatened John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, or both. The committee documents still unexplained phone contacts between Hoffa aides and Ruby within a month of the assassination, and says Hoffa had the motive, opportunity, and means to plan the murder.
Now, prior to that, there were 2 witnesses who were also subpoenaed to appear before the church committee, Johnny Rosselli and Sam Giancana, and both of whom were executed prior to their testimony. So there's speculation that Jimmy Hoffa would have gone to that committee and would have testified, at least in part truthfully. Certainly clear that those 3 murders were connected.
The CIA Mafia, Placido Castro, really weren't known until many years later, when Johnny Rosselli started talking, and then the church committee had their hearings, and it was understood that Jimmy Hoffa was cooperating with the church committee.
I think that was the culmination and the concern of the people or person who ended Jimmy Hoffa's life, that before that committee, Jimmy Hoffa was going to say something that nobody wanted him to say.
By 1990, I became the chief of the organized crime and racketeering section, and it was my unit that was charged with investigating the Hoffa disappearance. You would hear stories from guys who claimed they were asked to dispose of a car, or bring a package here, or bring a box here, and the Bureau correctly, assiduously pursued. Excited about, and ultimately turned out not particularly beneficial, was the DNA evidence on the hair sample. And
analysis was done. Hair, or more than one hair, was found in the car, in the passenger compartment of the car, that indicated that that Hoffa had been in that car. We had hair from his hairbrushes, and he said categorically, unequivocally, that that dog had put Hoffa's scent in the trunk that of Joey Giacaloni's Mercury. That gives you the idea that he was transported to wherever he was killed in the passenger compartment, and for whatever reason, when he was transported somewhere else, he was in the trunk.
Hoffa had been in that car, but the question is, was he in the car the day that he died, or the day that he disappeared? Who knows?
In 2003, investigators dug under a swimming pool in northern Michigan. In 2004, they ripped up the floorboards of a Detroit house.
Just where is Jimmy Hoffa? And that question hasn't been answered since the Teamsters boss disappeared 3 decades ago. But this week, the FBI showed up at a Michigan horse farm and started digging.
And I jumped out of my seat and I did a quadruple fist pump, hoping that it was the farm I wanted it to be. And slowly but surely the information came out, and it was Roland McMaster's farm. You know, they tore down the barn, they had to rebuild the barn, public money, controversy, the congressman out there raised hell, and the dig stopped. But the FBI said, their last statement to the New York Times was, we believe that Hoffa's body is buried here and that it has not been moved. And we may return to this place.
You know, you're always going to have some boss somewhere that wants to make his or her career on the fact that they were the one who was in charge when they found Jimmy Hoffa.
My name is Bob Foley. I'm with the FBI's Detroit Division. With me here, I've got Mike Bouchard, Oakland County Sheriff, and Jeff Garded with the Bloomfield Township Police Department. The FBI and our partners are here this morning to execute a search warrant based on information that we have involving the disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa.
His really story is that he heard the story from Tony Giacaloni.
Mr. Hoffa was picked up and taken and buried alive.
Anthony Zarelli gave the information, claiming that the property that Hoffa was put on was, at the time, was owned by Jack Tocco, his cousin and the convicted mob godfather of Detroit.
Looking for money, has had some financial reversals, is looking for money, trying to write a book, trying to get somebody to pay him some money.
Who has a Twitter account, who has a website and a Facebook, and a website that says hoffafound.com. Writing a book, who's supposedly going to disclose where Jimmy Hoffa's buried. It's the kind of behavior that would make Lucky Luciano spin in his grave. And that's what traditional organized crime has come to here, at least here in Detroit.
You know, to me, it is a giant wild goose chase. The fact that there are people running around trying to find a...
And I don't think we're ever going to know.
Yeah, I think both the champions of Hoffa and his detractors are wrong. His champions think that he was this great, wonderful, crusading union leader who cared about the working class and his rank and file. I don't see any evidence for that. His detractors see him as this immoral satanic figure who was willing to sell out his members for anything. Hoffa was simply a product of his times. Hoffa was militant because he had to be. Hoffa was able to be militant because he could be. Hoffa was simply interested in advancing himself and his career, in enlarging his power within the union and the labor movement. He had no other motives. He was a product of his times, and that explains why he was who he was.
Jimmy Hoffa had outlived his usefulness and he knew too much, so it was just easier to kill him. He had played a very complex game for a long time, and eventually he overplayed his hand, and that was it.
Was he a true believer? Because I think early on he was a true believer in terms of workers' rights. It becomes difficult for him to detach from these partnerships that he formed with the underworld. People are coming after him within his own labor movement. The feds are coming after him. I think that's a nice way of thinking about it, a Shakespearean tragedy. How do you navigate through these complicated moral questions?
If it wasn't for Jimmy Hoffa and others like him to fight on behalf of workers, there wouldn't have been that huge middle class that girded the country during the so-called golden age of the 50s and 60s. He had to get his hands dirty to do it, and he loved the power and the perks that came with it, but so do politicians like the Kennedys, and so do the so-called captains of industry who he bandled. He didn't go to an Ivy League college, he wasn't born with connections, but he became one of the most powerful men in the country one of the most loved men and one of the most hated. They don't make men like Jimmy Hoffa anymore, at least not in America.